Okay, let's start. Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Levitsky. I'm director of the Rockefeller Center here at Harvard. Welcome back to our Dr. Class Tuesday webinar. And as always, I want to begin by introducing my wonderful co-chair, Francis Agopian. You're Francis again.
Francis, very formal. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have everyone with us today.
I also want to introduce and thank our Dr. Class team of Paula Ibarra, Jillian Scales, and Gabrielle Patterson, as well as our Spanish translator. They are the team that makes this webinar work. Little bit of housekeeping before we start. First of all, we have, as I just mentioned, translation into Spanish. If you want to hear any of the presentations or all the presentations in Spanish, just go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Second of all, as always, we'll be recording today's event, and it'll be available on the Dr. Class YouTube channel shortly after the session today. Third, and most importantly, if you have questions for our panelists at any point during the presentation, we would love to hear them or actually read them. Send them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Fran and I will be taking questions toward the end, and we will feed as many of the questions to the panelists as we can. So at any point during the presentation, during the talk, or later, if you've got a question, just send it through the Q&A function and we will do our very best to get to it. Okay, so our panel today continues our look at some of the challenges facing contemporary Latin American democracies. And today we look at the recent wave of protest and repression that's hit various parts of the region, both before and after the beginning of the pandemic. As all of you know, I think very widespread public discontent triggered a pretty massive periods of protest in recent years in Ecuador and Colombia and Chile and Bolivia, even in Cuba. And in some cases, these protests have triggered some pretty serious repression with potentially important implications for democracies. And to help us better understand both the causes and the consequences of these recent protest waves, we have invited 4 outstanding scholars, 3 of them from outside Harvard and 1 of our own. And I will introduce, as I usually do, all of the speakers up front, and then we'll ask them to speak for 10 minutes each. We have 3 speakers, and then Yanilda Gonzalez will serve as a discussant. And that should leave us with about 30 or 40 minutes for Q&A, during which Fran and I will take your questions and feed them to the panelists. I've got to close pretty sharply at 1:20 today. So let's get to our wonderful panelists. First of all, I want to thank all of you for taking the time. Our first speaker will be Juan Albarracín, who is a visiting assistant professor at the Keough School of Global Affairs at University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on threats to democratic rights posed by large-scale violence in Latin America. His work lies at the intersection of studies of democratization, political and criminal violence, social movements, and political institutions. His current book project, which is entitled Criminalized Electoral Politics, Politicians and Criminals Subverting Democracy in Brazil, looks at the effect of criminal governance on democratic processes. Juan, thanks so much for coming. Our second speaker is Loreto Cox, who is assistant professor at the School of Government at the Potificia Universidad Catolica de Chile. She has a PhD in political science from MIT, just down the road in 2019. She specializes in political behavior and higher education, and her research, or at least her dissertation research, focused on the crucial question of expected versus actual results of higher education in Chile, which I think, as you'll see, has had a lot to do with the Chilean protests. Loreto, welcome. Our third speaker is Ximena Velasco-Guachalla, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Government at the University of Essex. She's an expert on the sources of rising protests in Latin America, focusing on helping us understand the context in which some protest demands are likely to materialize and others are not. Professor Velasco-Guachalla's book project, Protesting for More, Corruption, Democracy, and the Making of Demands, looks at the relationship between political corruption, democracy, and the number of demands made in the streets. In addition to studying protests, Professor Velasco-Guachalla also has an active research agenda on attitudes toward democracy, on elections in Latin America, political participation in autocracies, indigenous attitudes in Bolivia, and the informal sector across the region. I'm exhausted just reading that, Ximena. It's pretty impressive. Ximena, great to meet you. Thank you for coming. And finally, our discussant today is our own Yanilda Gonzalez, who's Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor Gonzalez's research focuses on policing, state violence, and citizenship and democracy, looking at how race, class, and other forms of inequality shape these processes. Her recent book, which I strongly recommend, Authoritarian Police and Democracy, Contested Security in Latin America, came out with Cambridge University Press last year. It examines the persistence of police forces as authoritarian enclaves in otherwise democratic states, looking at how ordinary democratic politics and unequal societies can both reproduce authoritarian policing and bring about some rare moments of expansive reform. Professor Gonzalez received her PhD from Princeton University, and prior to coming to HKS, she taught at the University of Chicago. Yanilda, welcome. So let's start with Juan, and I will retreat from the stage.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, the David Rockefeller Center, for this wonderful invitation to discuss this really crucial topic in Latin America currently. I'm going to focus today on this new wave of contentious politics in Colombia that really attracted the world's attention in May and June because of the duration of a protest over a month and a half, roughly, of sustained protest in a lot of Colombia's large metropolitan areas because of its intensity, but also because of the severe level of state repression that was observed throughout this process. The Inter-American Commission of Human Rights developed a report that really kind of extensively describes the level of state repression that was observed during this wave of protest. And thinking about Colombia in this context is particularly interesting because Colombia has been somewhat of an anomaly in the region when you think about sustained urban protests. This is not something that is frequent, at least not frequent in this scale. And until very recently, most of the sustained protests that we had observed in Colombia was mostly rural phenomenon. So we had protests at fairly large scale involving peasants, indigenous communities, and Afro-Colombian communities in the past, like the agrarian strike of 2013 and several forms of indigenous mobilization and mobilization around the cocaleros, so coca producing peasants. But this wave of urban protests is something rather uncommon in Colombia. And this all starts not in May or June of 2021, but we can start seeing what is going to become this huge episode of contention early on before the pandemic. So we had been seeing in Colombia right after the peace agreement of 2016, protests by student movements demanding better education and better access to higher education. In November 2019, very close to this cycle of contention that we had seen in other Latin American countries, we had kind of this very big episode of protest that slowly kind of faded away because of the pandemic, and I will speak a little bit about that later. And in September of 2020, we had, in the middle of the pandemic, some days of urban protests specifically associated with the question of police violence and police repression. And this all comes to kind of becomes very evident in May and June, late April, May, and June of this year with the Paro Nacional. And what is also particularly interesting of this new wave of contention is not only that it's occurring in an urban setting in Colombia, but that we have a new and more diverse set of actors that are participating in these forms of collective action. So some of the usual suspects are involved and are probably the most visible to external reporting, like the Comité Nacional del Paro, which includes members of the most traditional unions in Colombia, and their usual repertoires. But we started seeing, and what was very unique of this wave of protest is the involvement of extremely marginalized young protesters in many of these urban spaces, particularly in the city of Cali. And we start seeing the use of other repertoires that might be common in other parts of Latin America, but for Colombian context were more or less new. And the involvement and new roles of new roles for these younger protesters in it. And also, while this seems, it's always used this idea of this national character of protest, it is important to know that this protest was profoundly decentralized. So while we see, and I see the map in Colombia, this happens across Colombia, and hence Paro Nacional, it is important to understand its multi-level character. So we have a framing of the Paro Nacional at the national level, but in order to understand the dynamics of escalation and repression, we have to really look at some subnational and local factors as well. And as this map shows, clearly it is not, protests didn't happen everywhere. And it is particularly concentrated in these kind of regions of Colombia, Valle, Risaralda, Bogota, Antioquia, that are also traditionally the less poor, more developed areas of Colombia. So when we think about national factors that facilitated what happened, I think the first thing to think about is that 2016 marks a change in Colombian politics with the peace agreement with the FARC. And this has multiple implications for contentious politics in Colombia. On the one hand, this central cleavage of Colombian politics, which is the armed conflict, loses salience, and other issues, socioeconomic issues, become more relevant in public discussion. Also linked to this is the idea that protest as a repertoire becomes more acceptable. Unfortunately, in the past, the idea of protest and social protest was linked to more violent and say insurgent repertoires of action. So it was kind of like Colombia's use of protest repertoires, or Colombians' use of repertoires, was very limited because it was seen as closely linked with more insurgent forms of collective action. So the idea that the peace agreement kind of makes it possible that these new forms of protest emerge without being linked to these other, to insurgency, for that matter, to be more clear. And at the same time, this peace agreement did not reform our security forces in Colombia. So there was no significant security sector reform, and in part that is by design. There was a red line of the government not to touch how the military and the police forces are organized. So we entered this new way, this new era of democratic politics in Colombia with a very militarized police force, and Yanilda's work can definitely tell us more about this, that is not only organizationally militarized, so police force, national police is part of the Ministry of Defense, but also in the way it's socialized and in when it relates to citizens, and particularly citizens that it deems are creating social disorder. So it is not surprising that this police that was heavily involved in armed conflict and is incredibly militarized has a tendency to respond with high levels of violence and repression towards protest. We also have a very weak national government that is trying to push through some very, how do you say that nicely, very controversial policies regarding fiscal policies in a moment where Colombia was severely strained. And at the same time, this very weak government who's trying to push through a policy that is incredibly unpopular, also within its own ranks, cannot make concessions because it is kind of trapped within its own party, a party that advocates clearly for more punitive and more mano dura responses to social protest. So we have these big kind of national level aspects of what enables protest, but also what kind of characterizes the response of the government. And we have the pandemic that initially kind of freezes protests because we're all kind of stuck at home. But the pandemic then creates an incredible and dramatic impoverishment in Colombia, particularly in these cities that have been traditionally having lower levels of poverty, of multidimensional poverty, but also monetary poverty. So the pandemic really hit the urban poor and created a new urban poor. Just to give you an example, Before the pandemic, Cali had a poverty rate about 20.9%. After it's 36.3%. So it's a difference of 14 percentage points. And this particularly affected the lowest quintile in income distribution, who saw a loss in income of about 50%. So we have the pandemic hitting severely cities, and in this context of a very strained urban population, you have this policy, an attempt by the government to enact a fiscal policy that is seen as creating new onerous taxes on consumers. If it does or not, it's another question, but that's the perception. And there's this big reaction, and people just kind of use this paro nacional that is created by these national entities, these kind of unions, and this becomes kind of the frame to which all these other issues start coming, just kind of grouping together. So what we end up having is this kind of national frame of the paro, but at the subnational level, we just have incredible variation of where protest is happening, as the previous map, but also why people are protesting. So this is a map of Cali, and this is data from the Institutos Culturales of the Javeriana University in Cali. And they really mapped out what protesters were asking for in each of the points. And it's very diverse. From police reform to we want something in our park to a school. So we have these kind of national frames, but within this national frame, people just go to the streets, mostly without like a formal organization behind them, really trying to manifest their discontent from national issues to very local issues. So dealing with the situation is incredibly complex, and that's where the kind of local levels of government become crucial to try to understand dynamics of escalation, de-escalation. So certain governments were more able to respond to the demands, these very highly localized demands presented by the protesters, whereas others were incredibly unsuccessful in managing the situation, as is the case of Cali. At the same time, certain regions of Colombia where we have like pre-existing histories of conflict and violence, like Cali, become the epicenters of some of these, of certain forms of violence. So it is not surprising in Cali, that has a racialized history of violence, among other things, that you start seeing these very dramatic forms of violence, not only from in the side of state repression, but also forms of privatized violence. People, civilians, armed, shooting at protesters, these very dramatic images that were captured by the international press. So when we start seeing why this is starting to unveil, is like we have local governments that are completely unable to deal with the very localized forms of protest. You have a national government that is insisting on repression as its main strategy and very reluctant to engage with dialogue, but also very difficult dialogue, because national level discussions really they have very little to do with the requests that are being seen in the very local area. So you had to have a very multi-level strategy of negotiation, which really didn't happen systematically until very much later. This description of what happened in Colombia and kind of this multi-level nature of protest kind of shows us this is not going to leave. This is a kind of a sign of new ways of engaging in politics in Colombia. New movements, new organizations, new connections, and new ways of demanding citizenship. And this is something that became really clear when you listen to some of the protesters in many of these puestos de resistencia or protest, whatever you want to call them, a sense that this is how they're coming up and demanding citizenship and recognition as citizens by the state. But at the other hand, many of the repertoires of contention that we use are highly debated. So you can imagine that the police at this point is really not the most popular institution in Colombia, and polls have shown that. But why the police is unpopular, this is particularly interesting. For some, it's because of state repression, but some polls taken in Cali, which were really interesting and during the protests, show that some people have a negative view of the police, because it didn't repress enough. So and it didn't repress certain repertoires that were seen as unvalid or illegal. So what you have here is a moment in which the repertoires are being used for social protest are really under contention as well. And that creates a very polarizing moment as we lived through in the last couple of months in Colombia. So I'm gonna cut there. Sorry if I extend my time. And
Thanks, Juan. Our next speaker is Loreto Cox.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. It's great to be here. And today I'm going to talk about the case of Chile, and especially from the viewpoint of the citizens. So as you probably know, in October 2019 in Chile, a high school protest over the rise of the subway fare escalated suddenly into violence, with several subway stations set on fire and a national social upheaval unseen since the return of democracy. And this upheaval dramatically changed national politics, including making the way to a new constitution. So this social movement had no leaders, and protesters confronted any politician who showed up in demonstrations. And there was no official narrative, no representatives, and a very wide variety of demands. So studying a leaderless movement makes it even more relevant to focus on the protesters. Who are the people behind these protests? And this is the question that we tried to address in a working paper with Ricardo Gonzalez and Carmen Lefulon. And we designed a rich survey, which was fielded by the Centro de Estudios Públicos in December 2019. This was in the midst of the upheaval in Chile. It was a national representative survey, face-to-face. We follow Basinger in his study of the Ukraine revolution, and we build a typology of citizens based on the support of and participation in protests. So this is more or less how it looks. We have 17% of strong protesters. These are people who supported and protested more than once. Weak protesters, who are about 9%, and these are the people who protested just once, probably in the very large demonstration we had on October 25th. We have 36% of supporters. These are people who supported but did not participate in protests. 20% of opponents. These were people who opposed the protests. And 18% of people who did not take position about the protests. So I want to go very quickly through the main findings of the study, and then I will move to a specific issue that I think is especially relevant for this panel. And the main findings are the following. So first, protesters tend to be young and educated. They do not come disproportionately from the less well-off in any sense. We use many different measures and they do not come from the less well-off. They are high-frequency users of social media. They are interested in politics and they strongly identify with the left. They had a very anti-incumbent stance. But still, their ideologies regarding equality or the role of government were not radically different from other groups. They do perceive higher levels of inequality and are more skeptical of meritocracy. Thus, there are more contrasts in terms of the perceptions regarding inequality than in terms of what their ideal worlds in terms of inequality, the role of government, the role of markets, and so on and so forth. And finally, protesters value democracy. They are less authoritarian and they really value democracy, but they are very critical of how it works in Chile. They are very distrustful of institutions and they think that democracy works terrible in Chile. So now I will move to this, to the topic I want to focus on, which is the justification of different actions during protest in Chile. And as you can see here, strong protesters, both strong and weak protesters, but especially strong protesters, are much more likely to support illegal behavior in the context of protests, such as evading transport fees, always or almost always, and also violent behavior, such as participating in barricades to protest. They are much more likely to support this kind of behavior, always or almost always. And when we turn our attention to the use of force by the police, this follows the opposite pattern. Support for the police using force against a violent protester is relatively low across the board, but is almost inexistent among protesters. Here, you can see. And note that this is force against a violent protester, not any protester. Thus, we find that among protesters, there is no support at all for the use of force by the police. And the differences we see here in the justification of actions during the context of protest are very large differences. And in fact, they are larger than the differences that we observe, for instance, when we ask questions regarding inequality. So we believe that here, regarding the justification of illegal behaviors, violent behaviors, and the behaviors by the police, there is a key point to try to understand the Chilean upheaval. So what can be behind this lack of support for the use of force by the police among protesters? And we think that crucially, there is a very strong perception that the police abused human rights always or almost always. As you can see, this belief is very widespread across the board, again, but it is like really extended among strong protesters. More than 90% believe that always or almost always the police abused human rights. And it's very striking that even we included questions asking for who was responsible for the fires in the subway stations, and it included the option of an open-ended answer. And 1 out of 5 strong protesters, as you can see here, said that they believed that it was the police who set the subway stations on fire. So there is a very negative perception of the police and the military. There is the idea that they not only abused human rights, but that even it was them who started like the upheaval by setting the subway stations on fire. And this for sure fuels the lack of justification for the use of violence and force by the police. So I want to finish with a short reflection. As I said before, the differences that we find by groups in the propensity to justify the use of violence by citizens and the police are enormous, much greater than those we found on other dimensions of ideology, such as positions regarding inequality. So I think this is a key dimension that we must understand of the Chilean crisis. And despite being strongly in favor of democracy, we find that strong protesters are more prone to justify the use of violence to achieve political goals. In my view, this is problematic. I believe that one of the main virtues of democracies is that it bets for the resolution of conflict without violence. And I think that maybe the persistence of violence that we observed 2 years after the beginning of the upheaval with a constitutional process going on is probably related to relevant numbers of the population believing that it is justified to use violence as a means for social change. So what's behind this justification of violence, especially among people who cherish democracy? And I just want to, I don't have like the real answer to this, I just want to raise some questions. I think this is a very important issue to study in Chile, of course, but also in other places. And as some hypotheses, I want to raise 3 questions. First, it may be because they perceive that democracy is too flawed, that it is impossible to make changes through the democratic process. I think there are indications of this. Protesters are very distrustful of how democracy works. They believe that economic interests have undue influence in democracy and so on and so forth. So I think that that's one line of argument. Second, it may be because of the vicious cycle of violence and repression by the police. There's a lot of literature on this, and I think it's an important element behind this. As we saw, the perceptions of abuse by the police are very strong, especially among strong protesters, and for sure this plays a role in this kind of paradox between cherishing democracy and supporting and justifying the use of violence. And in the third place, it may be that strong protesters trivialize the use of violence. They don't think it's really something important. This may be true, especially among younger generations. We observe that younger generations are much more prone to justify the use of violence, and perhaps the relative peace resulting from the institutional framework of the last 3 decades in Chile prevented younger generations from noticing that in a world where all means are allowed, only force beats force, and there is no possible democracy. So in any case, there may be more answers to this sort of paradox, but I think that the problem of the justification of violence is an important question of our times in Chile and elsewhere. And in Chile, we are already seeing a law and order kind of response to violence with the growth of José Antonio Kast, the presidential candidate from the far right, who has a very law and order stance, and who's now leading the polls for the November election, and has broad support in the lower and the middle classes. So I think that the justification of violence is a problem that we really need to pay attention to. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, our third speaker is Professor Ximena Velasco-Guachalla. Here we go.
Okay, first, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with everybody. I'm going to present to you some work that I've been doing with a great team. I'm going to specifically focus on protests in Bolivia during the pandemic. I will cover some of the protests that happened before, but here the effort is understanding what drove protests in Bolivia during 2020. Okay, so despite having many reasons not to go to protest, many Bolivians actually took on the streets every month. And this is not necessarily unique to Bolivia. Many other countries actually protested during the pandemic. What perhaps makes Bolivia a little bit of an interesting case is the intensity and the frequency with which people actually went to protest, despite having, in theory, one of the most strictest lockdowns in the region. So here are just some pictures of the many protests. Some of them were very small, 5 people. There were large, massive protests across the country in late July, early August. The demands were very varied, and I'm gonna share with you just that in a minute. So let me tell you a little bit about the project. Now, this is a great project that I work with an amazing team, and I wanna just give a shout out to them. Now, Kala Homel from the University of Miami, Jamie Nelson Yunes from the University of New Mexico, and Kirill Bolding from the University of Colorado Boulder. For this project, we collected a daily subnational data on political and public health variables in real time during the pandemic. We started this project, I believe, early May, and so we backtracked to March is when the pandemic hit Bolivia, and we started collecting data there. And we started collecting data on cases, deaths, and protests. We work under the umbrella of a larger team that was the Observatory for the Containment of COVID-19, led by the University of Miami. We were the Bolivia team, and with them, the effort was to collect data on COVID cases and deaths and mobility. What we did as a unique part of that team was work on protest and collect subnational data on protest. This project is ongoing, but we have already published some peer review articles on this, and I'm going to give you here and there some of the findings that we had from those. So let me start with some of the context, because if you have been following Bolivia, you probably know first and foremost that Bolivia is one of the countries in the region that really uses protest as a mechanism to ask things from government. So it's not new. Perhaps on the other extreme from Colombia, as Juan just mentioned, Colombia is not necessarily known for protesting a lot. Well, Bolivia is on the other side of the spectrum. In the capital city of Bolivia, if you want to go to the center of the city, you probably want to avoid using cars because there's going to be a protest in front of the presidential palace. So we have a very mobilized civil society, and protest is used very common as a way of demanding things from the subnational government as well as the national government. So what shaped the pandemic, or what was happening in Bolivia prior to the pandemic? So in 2019, we had a political crisis. The former president Evo Morales resigned under allegations of electoral fraud. There were protests prior, excuse me, there were protests for his resignation. There were protests after his resignation. So since November 2019, protests were pretty much a daily occurrence in terms of intensity and frequency, even more so than previous years in the country. But what happened after his resignation? There was an interim government, and here you have the picture of Yanilda Áñez. She was the interim government right after Evo Morales resigned. The picture above is actually protests that were demanding the resignation of Evo Morales. She took on power. There is a whole debate about whether or not she actually did this constitutionally. Unfortunately, she's now in jail, waiting trial. There is a huge discourse in Bolivia right now about this. I'm not gonna touch on that. But she took on power. Bolivia was under an interim government during the pandemic. And then the picture at the bottom are protests against her government. So one of the key features of Bolivia entering the pandemic was contested legitimacy over who should actually be in government. The citizenry was very polarized. It was two blocks, MAS was the political party of Evo Morales, and anti-MAS citizens. And so under this polarization is the context of Bolivia. And this matters a lot because Bolivia is decentralized and many subnational governments were from strongholds from the MAS, whereas the national government was now in the hands of the opposition to the MAS. So for us, this is kind of the political context that we're most interested in terms of what shaped the protests in the pandemic. We also think that weak state capacity matter a lot. I'm gonna share some of the demands that people had throughout the pandemic, and state capacity was definitely one of those, as well as the large informal sector in the country. And Bolivia has more than 60% of people that live on a daily income, and given the heavy restrictions that we had, people could not go out. In the most rigid quarantine, only one member of a family could go out from 7 a.m. to noon to do groceries. And so that was in sharp contrast to what people had to do on a daily basis to actually earn their living. So what is the data that we collected and how we did this? We collected daily observations from the 9 departments. So we started first with the 9 departments in Bolivia. We are now moving into the collecting data for subnational level and at the municipal level. So here we have some of the reports that the government would release. The government was relatively efficient in releasing COVID information. COVID hit Bolivia in March. By April, we already had this sort of reports that were released by the Ministry of Health. So kind of there were some inconsistencies in the reporting of the data. And there is definitely the worry that they were under-reporting the data. This is not just true in Bolivia, but in many other countries. But we used a lot of government data and tried to validate this data with other sources. We collected event data for protests, so we used newspapers. Perhaps the nice thing about collecting protest data in terms of the pandemic is that when things are normal, small protests tend to not be observable. Newspapers don't pay attention to very rural protests. Even the newspapers themselves of that department are not very good at reporting what is happening. And this is especially true for national level newspapers. In terms of the pandemic, we were able to collect a lot of protest data because under the restrictions, any violation to lockdown rules would actually make things very visible. And newspapers were reporting it any very small protests to very large demonstrations. So we collected this data from March to November 2020. And then we also collected movement data from Google, or mobility data. And this is kind of the graph that you have here. Bolivia had, again, one of the strictest lockdowns, especially from March to June. And we were collecting this data also to see compliance with lockdowns restrictions. Now, what happened? For us, again, legitimacy was very important. The national government, the executive, was under the direction of Yanilda Áñez. She was in opposition to the MAS, but the legislature and Congress was under the MAS. So from the get-go, we have divided government. And although from March to May, a lot of the restriction rules were imposed by the national government and were supposed to be followed by everybody, after June, the government decided to let subnational governments guide their own policies. There were a couple of things that remained constant, for example, the closure of borders. But in terms of policy making, some national governments had more freeway into deciding what they wanted to do. And one of the most striking things that shaped the pandemic, and again, for us, this contested legitimacy, the mass and anti-mass camps shaped policy. Not only policy, but also compliance. So what we have here is the use of chlorine dioxide. That is not, there are not many studies, if any, about the use of this chemical for COVID. Nonetheless, the national government, or excuse me, the legislature, the mass control legislature approved its use, even though the executive was outspokenly suggesting and alarming the population against the use of this chemical. So the population were receiving very mixed messages. And those who were mass supporters were were getting the information from all the sources that were coming from the mass. And those who were against the mass were receiving and feeding their information from just the executive. So we had a lot of first misinformation. We had a lot of confusion about what was happening. But this is because the context in Bolivia made it very difficult for people to decide who they should obey beyond their political affiliation. So this was one of the strongest cases. One of the things that also happened is the use of international funds. There was also a big fight there. And this is also at the subnational level. Subnational governments were either not making regulations, national regulations comply, or they were blatantly saying that COVID didn't exist, for example. And so this is a graph of the daily cases and the protest events that we collected. And you can see that, again, protests at the beginning of the rigid quarantine did happen. They were far less in frequency at the beginning, but they nonetheless existed. And the peaks here, for example, in June, a lot of the demands for this time of the year were state capacity-wise. A lot of people were asking for biosecurity material. A lot of people were asking for the government to provide more resources for hospitals. But the biggest wave, and many of the waves actually that you see here, are pro-election protests. And this is, again, kind of the map for what was happening in Bolivia. What were the departments? So the table that you have on the left side is protest counts by department. So we see that the largest departments, Cochabamba, La Paz, and Santa Cruz, not surprisingly, had the largest events, the larger percentages. But even smaller departments per capita had very big events. And bigger cities, the map on the right side is at the municipal level. So the darker municipalities are actually the big cities. So that's not necessarily surprising. Big cities tend to have in Bolivia more protest participation. But we can also see that protest participation was very varied across the municipal level. So it was happening in most municipalities. And during the protest in July and early August, where people were asking and were demanding elections, is where we see this big hike right here. So Bolivia was scheduled to have elections in May 3rd, but due to the pandemic, that was delayed, and that was delayed 3 times. And every single time, the first delay was reached through a consensus, so there was not a lot of protest. So you can see here, May, there was not a lot of, not a big frequency of protests. And this is primarily because different political actors from different political parties, including a consensus of the executive government and the mass, reached this. However, once the elections were pushed a second and a third time, especially the third time, this is where we see this really huge spike in early August. The country was paralyzed during this time. And for many, this actually prevented the distribution of health resources and led to people dying. Many of the blockades were connecting very important highways in Bolivia. Somewhat ironically, even though this was the biggest wave against the pushing of elections, the date didn't change. And a lot of people are still a little bit puzzled. And a lot of the mass, the mass is also not necessarily a cohesive body right now. There are factions within the party. And so the consensus was that those on top of the mass agree with the executive, whereas those at the bottom wanted elections immediately. And these are the demands that we had. Again, this is for us kind of primary evidence that politics really shaped and took precedence in the pandemic, even at the expense of health. So pro-election demands were at the top, followed by economic cooperation and aid. A lot of people went protesting, asking for funds from the government or subsidies to fight or to be able to live on a daily basis. There were other things, for example, parents were protesting against the school closure. That's kind of falls under the other category. And then the fourth one is health resources, especially in June and July when the death cases or the death rate was increasing. A lot of people protested from across the political spectrum, demanding biosecurity and the betterment of hospitals. And then we have here a timeline of the primary demand by month. And I think this is useful in kind of telling us what was happening in the country at the time. So March, not much elections, but then July and August really became everything about elections. And so some conclusions for us, this data really tells us that in the case of Bolivia, and because of the political crisis, because of the confusion about who should be leading, and also the mixed messages that people were receiving from the executive and from lower branches of government, really shaped not just the management of the pandemic, but the compliance of lockdown regulations. Again, state capacity and informal sector matter for what kind of demands people made, but for many political actors and analysts, elections were seen really as the only pathway to pacify the country and avoid greater ungovernability. And this is kind of why people were pushing a political resolution through elections during the pandemic. Sorry if I passed a little bit of my time. Someone end it.
Oh, you were perfect. So we now have, it's a great pleasure to have as a discussant, Yanilda Gonzalez. Yanilda, you there?
Thank you so much to Juan, Loreto, Ximena for these fantastic presentations. I have so many comments. I'd love to be able to chat more with each of you about this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to limit myself to I think about 5 main points or / questions that we can either sort of discuss broadly or just blend in with the discussion of that will come with the fantastic audience questions in a few minutes. So first, I find one thing that I find really striking about the 3 presentations, and I think more broadly in terms of how we have been talking about protests in the current like last few years in Latin America, is a contrast with the kind of older literature in Latin American politics that's looked at protests as destabilizing, right? The sort of literature on sort of mass protests, really talked about, the unrest, instability, the toppling of presidents, that's kind of, very, very broadly, and that's painting with a very broad brush, I recognize, but that's one framing that existed in the literature, in an older literature in Latin American politics. And yet one thing that I'm seeing in sort of the way that we've been talking about this wave of protests is really the way that it can be a possible space for democratic opening, right? I think in particular Juan and well, actually, I think that was a theme across the 3 cases, right? The kind of post-peace agreement period in Colombia, the sort of new constitutional process in Chile, the new elections that it gave way to in Bolivia. So that's really exciting, right, to see protests being talked about in that way. And it's not necessarily, it's not across the board, right? We have cases where repression and a sort of a deepening authoritarianism also happened, as we saw in Nicaragua, which I think June brought up in the Q&A. But so I'll come back to this at the end about sort of thinking about what are the longer term consequences of democracy of this protest movement. But just to begin with, I think it's really notable and promising to see this sort of newer framing of protests in Latin America. A second theme that was in the 3 presentations, and that I also want to really think with all of you about, is the role of the pandemic. You all brought it up, obviously, but the mechanisms under which the pandemic, or the extent to which did it, drive mobilizations itself. Sort of what are the pathways through which, a global pandemic such as what we all experienced could have been a factor in driving mobilizations, obviously not just in the three countries we're discussing here, but really throughout the region and throughout the world? Was it the fact that it further marginalized already marginalized communities and led to their mobilization? Was it, the fact that societal responses to the pandemic mapped onto pre-existing cleavages in the way that Ximena was describing in the Bolivian case? Was it about a disillusionment with how governments responded to the pandemic and the sort of, mass preventable, many instances deaths that we saw? Did it crystallize other social and institutional failures that were then reflected in that government response? Were the protests a form of collective grief? Based on what we all were experiencing at that time, right? Just maybe a question for all of us to take away from this is sort of what was the role of the pandemic explicitly in driving, if at all, driving these mobilizations? A third question or / point is that I found really fascinating in the presentations is sort of what were the demands, what was driving the protest, right? So there was some discussion across the three presentations, sort of local versus national frames and politics, which I think is really interesting, right? Sort of how we link individuals, communities, decisions to protest to sort of national demands, national events. It's interesting that particularly in the Colombian and Chilean cases, the protest began with really concrete causes, the I think it was tax reform in Colombia, and the subway fare in Chile, but then turning into this broader estallido social, right? Sort of what is the kind of frame? How do the people broadly, how are these protests going to be understood? In the context of these shifting frames, shifting context, shifting demands. And related to this is one thing that was really fascinating about, I think, all three presentations is also the introduction of new actors in driving protests, new repertoires. I think this is, but also I want to maybe not just to think about to what extent were there also continuities, right? The student mobilizations in Colombia leading to the Constitutional Convention in 1990, 1991, as just one example. But sort of, to what extent was there kind of a rupture with old actors and old repertoires, right? This sort of now move toward leaderless movements that many of you discussed, right? Sort of what is going to be the kind of takeaway from all of this down the road? Sort of what are protest movements going to look like given this diverse array of actors, demands, national versus local frames, etc. The fourth theme that I thought was really fascinating were, and this is where, my own work on policing made me pretty attuned to this, but I think it, really was quite salient across the presentations, is the view toward police and repression, right? Because I think one thing that is, this is certainly the case for the United States and many other contexts as well, but the ways that protests themselves are can be polarizing, even though they also represented this coming together moment of a lot of different societal groups, and the kind of what I call kind of a convergence of preferences and attitudes that these protests represent. They also can be polarizing, particularly once you introduce police responses and police repression. Right. One of the things that I often find notable is I forget who was. I was on some other panel recently, and somebody was saying, so there's no situation that police can't make worse. And I think that the protests sort of reflect this, because even though, as I mentioned, a lot of these protests begin with other causes, but police end up making themselves central to the story and central to the demand making just by virtue of their responses. That the police themselves become a target of protest in addition to responding to the protest because of how they responded to protests. And so this has really highlighted, though, the divisions in how people think about the police, and I think Juan in particular, but also Loreto, highlighted how there's a real division in understanding, like, this is something that I find in my research all the time, that there's of course people who protest police violence and criticize police violence, but there's also always a sector of society that criticizes police for being not violent enough. And so these divisions, this fragmentation, as I call it, like really makes police reform a challenge. And so this is another sort of layer to the kind of my final point, which is about sort of what are going to be the broader effects on democracy, sort of to kind of put a pin on the policing question of this, is sort of if this leads to a democratic opening, what is going to be possible if these divisions about policing still remain. I think my work shows how these divisions with respect to policing can really complicate any kind of democratic project or any kind of reform project. And then just to close, all of your presentations left me wondering, what are going to be the broader effects of these protests on democracy, right? This is where I began. Like the framing has been much more about like, this is a promising fact, this is a promising occurrence to see all these people in the streets, demanding democracy, even as they're skeptical of it. But sort of what will be the broader implications of some of this, given some of what I've said, right? So Loreto examined the support for use of violence to achieve political objectives. What's going to be a broader implication of that when we think about kind of if this is a new democratic moment, what is going to be the implications of that? Omar Wasow in the US context has studied the effects of peaceful versus violent civil rights protests and how they affected elections, electoral outcomes in the United States really for the next generation. What is this going to look like in the Latin American context when we're seeing that, again, these divisions persisted, that protests, aligned with existing cleavages, et cetera, right? I think Loreto brought up the backlash that's going on in Chile. I think we saw a similar backlash in Colombia, and the support for a far-right candidate in the Chilean case. So what is going to be what's the takeaway from all of this? What is ahead for this, sort of protest wave, this sort of mobilization of new actors, new repertoires for the future of democracy in Latin America? So I'll stop there and turn it back to Steve for some of the audience questions. But again, thank you all for fantastic presentations. You gave us lots to think about, and hopefully this is just the start of this fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Professor Gonzalez. You've given us a lot to think about. I know, so you did in fact toss some good questions out for the group, but I want to give you panelists, an opportunity in just a second to respond to whichever of those you want to. Let me tack on, though, a couple of questions from the audience, and then maybe one of my own. Let's see. Yanilda pointed to a question by June Ehrlich in the Q&A, which is, actually, these are really tough questions, by the way. Let me preface that. So steel yourselves. The question is, why is it that we see, what do we know about the conditions under which large-scale protest brings pretty dramatic social change, like Chile, and cases where protest gets pretty effectively beaten down, perhaps without a lot of social or political change, at least visible social political change, like Nicaragua? What can we say about the conditions under which we get one or the other? Again, I know that's a tough question. Another tough question, one that I've been asked by journalists repeatedly over the last 4 years and do not have an answer to. So, but this is coming from the audience, so fair game for me to pass it on to you. And that is, can you identify any common threads across the protests in Latin America? What common threads do you see, if any, across the region's protests? And if I could just tack on a question that, and this is picking up on something that Yanilda pointed to, and this is for I guess mostly for Loreto and Juan. We've seen now pretty visible backlash against the right-wing backlash in both Chile and Colombia. Chile and Colombia are countries with a long history of pretty nasty authoritarian reaction in different forms, quite violent. What do we know about how protest leaders, I know these are very bottom-up, very disorganized protests, but what are protest leaders or protest activists rethinking, recalculating at all in light of this reaction, in light of Cast leading the polls in Chile? So let me turn it back to you. If you could try to keep your answers to 2 to 3 minutes if possible, that would be great.
Do I start, Steve? Or
No, why don't we go in this, just for simplicity's sake, we'll go in the same order.
Okay. Well, these are amazing questions and incredibly, as you said, incredibly difficult questions. I think regarding the first one about when does it bring about social change, that also kind of depends on what you understand as mass or big social change. I mean, what's happening in Chile with a new constitution, that is momentous for Chile. So compared to what we would see in Colombia, I don't think the expectation was having a new constitution in Colombia, but you do see a considerable change in certain attitudes and certain things that just seemed impossible before protest. I mean, the fact that the way the government retreated with most of its policies, now it seems like just peanuts, but it was a pretty big thing, and it also changed the attitudes of other important social actors within Colombia that are at some point during the protests were like a big economic elite saying, well, we're willing to get taxed more if this brings about some level of social peace. So you start seeing some readjusting from very critical elites in Colombia based on large-scale protests, something that they have probably never experienced in the sense. So I guess it depends on when you understand the social change. And I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the other case that they're bringing up in Nicaragua is, well, we're seeing here protests in democracies, and they're addressing issues that are not about regime change. And for all the repression that we saw in Chile and in Colombia, these are not fully fledged authoritarian or semi-authoritarian governments. They have constraints, and I think that really affects what we're seeing and how these protests can bring about social change. I'm going to go just for 10 seconds about the backlash. I think the backlash is an important thing to consider. And we saw this happening in Colombia, as Yanilda mentioned, as protest was happening, because as I said, these repertoires are not accepted widely as something that we, especially in Colombia, like blocking streets as a mode of gaining the government's attention is highly contentious. People really don't like it. And as this moved, intensified and remained in time, you could see society polarizing around the repertoires themselves. And it wasn't even about the content of what's being disputed, it's about how it's being disputed. So I'm following what Regina was saying. I think these new wave of protests, particularly in Colombia, it kind of is encouraging, and it kind of signals to a new potential democratic opening in Colombia, but it all depends on how we create some agreements, tacit ideational agreements about how we see these repertoires. And I think that's a learning process that is happening on both ends. It's not only about the protesters and if they're recalculating, but it's like for many of the people that were going to the streets in Cali, and it was maybe the first time they were going to protest, and maybe the first time they were going to a blockade. So there's things about protesting that you learn while you're protesting. For example, letting an ambulance go through for a blockade, you do not negotiate if the ambulance can go through or not. It's just kind of a rule. So these rules are things that you learn in time. But the question is, are these rules of engagement going to be developed quickly enough to reduce polarization or not? So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
That was great. Thanks. Loreto?
Thank you. So many good questions. I won't be able to tackle all of them. Why some protests succeed in bringing about social change and others do not? I don't know. I don't have like a general answer, but I think that in the case of Chile, well, of course, demonstrations were really, really massive. But then we had like an agreement, a political agreement with most of political parties, or what's left of political parties, because they are really weak these days. And they called for a referendum in this agreement. And in the referendum, the idea of writing a new constitution had 78% of the vote. So I think that this was or maybe perhaps because I really want to think that democracy is powerful, I think that like the institutional way and an election having a really, really broad agreement was key for Chile really starting a process of institutional change. And I would like to go to one of the points that Yanilda made at the beginning. This idea that protests are no longer like they don't mean instability, or they don't necessarily mean instability, and I agree. I think that protests nowadays and probably in the future will be part of democracies, especially in Latin American. We have citizens that are more critical. In Chile, we have citizens that are much more educated, that they are used to make their own decisions and self-determine what they want to be and believe. So I think that they are much more critical, and especially in Chile, we had several corruption scandals ranging from the church to the police. And these were like at the same time that the social networks were expanded throughout the population. So I think that this mix of several corruption scandals with social networks really diffuminated bad news about all kinds of elites, political elites, of course, but all kinds of elites. And this made citizens really, really distrustful about all anything that smells like power in Chile. And I think that this is, of course, a new constitution is a way of creating new rules, generating new elites. But I think that it will be very hard to build trust in new institutions, especially because I don't think that we'll be able to do that without political parties that can work, like have some support in the population. The public opinion in Chile doesn't want to hear anything about political parties. And the truth is that in the new constitution and the debate about the new constitution, I do not see like a real concern for how to build stronger political parties. So I think that that's something that should be worrying us. And right now, of course, anything can happen. Chilean politics is really moved these days, but we are probably facing the more polarized election since 1970. This will polarize society more, and I think it's a very complicated moment because we will have like this really polarized electorate in a context in which the constitution is changing without the stability that political parties can provide to the political system. And it could perfectly be that we will have like a far right president in the next election, or perhaps in 2 more elections, while we are changing and moving from one constitution to another. And this, of course, will generate lots of changes. And I think that it's like a complicated moment in terms of stability, especially since we lack strong political parties. Thank you.
Thank you. Ximena.
To get at 3 of them. The first, again, this is, I think, what makes a protest effective. The context matters a lot. From a lot of the research, existing research, and some of my own, we know that having a very clear message is very important. I can immediately think of the case of Chile, for example, where the demand was very clear later in the protest. Now, how the messages become clear throughout the protest is a different question, but we know that a lot of the protests that have a very clear message and a very clear demand tend to be more effective in terms of the amount of people that they may gather. I'm thinking also in the example of Bolivia, we have, again, a very organized civil society. So the ability of citizens or political actors to mobilize the citizenry with a very specific demand to ask for the government, because sometimes governments either don't find somebody with whom they can negotiate, or don't exactly, they say so, no, that they don't know what the message or the specific demand is. And so when we have a lot of people coming together with different demands, that government kind of uses that to water down what is it that people want. So clear messages, and also the ability to organize and mobilize. In the Bolivian case, that has worked extraordinarily. Protests are pretty effective here, but then again, this is because we have labor unions, we have syndicates that have very long histories, and they have learned, like Juan was saying, a learning process. Protesting and learning what works best is a learning protest. And in the case of Bolivia, for example, we do have a lot of civil society organizations that have been using this strategy for quite a long time, and they know what works and what doesn't work. In terms of what I see common across these themes, and this is from kind of seeing some of the data across the region, for me, what pops up is the variety of actors. And here I immediately think of the study of social movements before and the emphasis on labor unions. And here, even in Bolivia, even in places where protest is so commonplace, we're seeing new people wanting to protest, wanting to go out. Younger people, older people that may otherwise not want to deal with politics anymore. And one of the pieces of evidence that I enjoy most when seeing a variety of actors is the different tactics. One of the things that caught my eye when I was coding the protest data, for example, is the amount of artistic performances, virtual protests, and I think this is evidenced by the variety of actors and I think this is across the region at different degrees that I can see as an important factor and commonality across the region. And one question that Yanilda brought up and really has been my mind thinking is, what does this all mean for democracy? And I think that on one hand, the role of institutions, the faith that people have in institutions matter a lot for whether or not people choose to protest or not, or whether or not they think that things are going to work. So institutions on one hand, but also what is the vision of democracy for people? In the case of Bolivia, for example, both protests against and for the government, respondents do think that they're protesting for democracy, but they are on different sides of the spectrum. For one, the government is currently not legitimate, it's not a democratic process. For the other, it's exactly the same. So I think a consensus across the population about what is democracy, what do we want for democracy, and how we see our governments and the institutions mediating this vision is going to be very important for how we use protest and the effectiveness of protest as well.
Thanks. Yanilda, did you want to add anything?
No, I think they've said it all. I just won't take up any more time.
Oh, sorry, that gives us time for another quick round of questions, which I will hand off the baton to Fran.
Fran, no, not Francis. Okay, I'm going to try to follow Steve's lead and just ask two questions with one of my own tacked on to the second question. The first is a quite specific question, but an important one. So whoever can answer it should feel free to. Whoever doesn't have the information, hasn't done research on it, that's fine. And that is, what do we know about the police forces now? We know they're terribly important. We know they're unpopular in some places. We know that some opposition forces support them, but who are they? Has it been generational change in the police? Do the police continue to recruit among the young? Is it still an avenue of social mobility to join police forces? So who are the police? We know they've been militarized, but beyond that, at least in Colombia, but beyond that, we don't know a lot. And a second question is another very easy to answer question, and that is, what about the future? What kind of protests do you expect to see in the future? But I would like to sort of build on this question to engage Yanilda's very important beginning and ending points about the relationship between protests and democracy. So Yanilda, I guess I would say that it depends a little bit on the old view of whether you're looking at Sam Huntington in 1975 and the crisis of democracy, or whether you're looking at an older tradition of political culture studies where civic participation, including protests, including sit-ins, including writing letters, was all part of texturing. A skeptical citizenry was critical to having a vibrant democracy. But as we look at what has happened in a place like Chile, where there was, one could call consensus or one could call collusion among the political class for 20 years. There was sort of no way, apparently, to break open this political system other than to take to the streets. But in other places, this isn't necessarily true. And the question is, who is the target of the protests? If the target is the target of protest political society, is it like the civil rights movement trying to change laws? Or is it civil society itself and trying to change the way people think about institutions, politicians? I'm not sure it's ever a reason to celebrate when protests seem to signal the breakdown of representative democracy. Having popular participation, putting things on the agenda, pressuring the political class to respond is all a wonderful thing in a democracy. But I'm wondering if any of you can say anything about whether the targets have changed of protest and whether the protest is now about getting some specific policies, or it's just a manifestation of a general disgust with the political class, and whether this is more of what we can expect in the future. I'll stop there. And you've got 1.5 minutes each.
So 1.5 minutes. About the police, one of the fascinating things that you see when you, like the actual policemen on the ground who were doing the patrolling, they're not much different, socioeconomically speaking, and you would say generally speaking for many of them, from the people who are doing the protesting. So this is not like a elite group that is exercising repression on a subaltern group. You actually have people from subaltern groups who are part of the police. So the problem is not where the recruiting is happening in the police, at least in my opinion. And there's other, I think the issues is elsewhere, the organizational culture of the police and socializational practices. And I think Yanilda's work there is enlightening. The broader question, I think it's interesting when you look at, I'm going to focus really on what happened in Colombia, because during the protests, all forms of political representation, like parties, just completely disappeared. They were not even a part of the conversation. Congress was completely absent from these broader discussions. It was basically the government, the executive government, negotiating with a committee, but then at the local level, you really had kind of a reflection of that. So your kind of traditional mechanism of representation were really not there, and they just stepped out and completely. The question is, I think, essential is what happens with this kind of new civic move. That's not called a movement, but like these new forms of participation that we're not only asking for specific changes like the tax law or more local changes like a health clinic, but can they be articulated into new forms of political movements and parties? I don't know if that's going to happen, and because behind some of the claims that these protests are doing, there are claims of citizenship, of being recognized as a citizen by the state, and those feelings that the existing mechanisms were not doing that, and that the state was not recognizing their own citizenship. So I think the key question here is not is how these in Colombia very weak parties really try to successfully engage with these new forms of participation. And to tell you the truth, I don't see them really changing their mode of action to really become more inclusive of these new forms of participation.
Okay, so on the police, I'm not an expert on the police, not at all. But I wanted to say that the police in Chile was really like in deep trouble before this started. We had an important corruption scandal, the Paco Gate, and also there was a case where the police fabricated evidence. In Huracan was the name, and both of these cases had a lot of impact in the public opinion. And the trust in the police, which was relatively high throughout the democratic era in Chile, fell like dramatically in later years. So I think that the police was in a very, very bad moment when this started. And also after the dictatorship, there was a lot of effort put in the military to modernize the military, and this did not happen for the case of the police. So I think that they were really not well prepared. Their protocols were outdated. They had no civilian control. And really after these corruption scandals and fabrication of evidence, like they had no support in the public opinion, which I think was really important to understand this cycle of violence and repression in the context of protests. And as for Fran's question, well, really difficult question, but I agree with Juan in the case of Chile. Like the idea of political representation is in severe damage. There's an idea that all the political class is corrupt. Like the fall in the political identification with parties is enormous. At the beginning of the 90s, about 80% of the population identified with a political party, and nowadays that is around 13%, from 80 to 13% in just 30 years. And of course, there are several factors behind that. The binomial system, on the one hand, and not enough competition among parties. And also, I think there's a part that is due to the modernization process. As I said before, Chileans have also taken distance from the church, from any kind of institution that mediates their relationship with politics, with religion, so on and so forth. And we've seen similar movements in other places too. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
And I'm going to try to answer really fast. So in terms of the police in Bolivia, they were extremely important during the crisis of 2019. They actually conducted a mutiny that really tilted a lot of the dynamics of what happened in Bolivia. About the demographics of the police, a lot of people come from low-income families, but that doesn't necessarily mean that are going to be pro-government. There is a variation about what people that are part of the police actually think about the government. And in 2019, that actually became pretty evident. I think that the relationship between the police and government also mattered, because there were severing ties during the last 2-3 years prior to the 2019 crisis. Now, in terms of protests and democracy and Fran's question, what I see in Bolivia, it's on one hand, protesting from the side of this strong civic culture. People really trying to use protests as a mechanism of gaining or sustaining democracy. At the same time, I see protests as used by political actors to do the very opposite, and to kind of use this very democratic, in my view, way of demanding from the government to tilt the balance. And in a lot of the authoritarian literature, for example, we've seen the very use of civil society for authoritarian means, and protest being one of the repertoires for that. So I think in many countries, and again, specifically thinking about Bolivia, I think that these two things are living side by side. I'll stop there for the second time.
Thanks, Ximena. I unfortunately need to close, but first, I guess 3 points. First of all, Santiago Andrea gets the award for the best question that we didn't have time to answer. Santi, send your question in before 1:17 next time, okay? Secondly, I want to thank our speakers, Juan Albarracín, Loreto Cox, Ximena Velasco-Guachalla, and Yanilda Gonzalez for taking the time out of your busy schedules and sharing your research and your insights on this really, really important topic. We really appreciate your joining us. Finally, join us next week, where we'll change pace a little bit and hear Daniela Campello and Cesar Zucco talk about their fantastic new book, The Volatility Curse. So everyone have a great week and take care of yourselves. Thanks.